You're listening to the Tel Aviv Review here on TLV1. I am Gilad Halpern. Welcome back. I'm now joined by Professor Jonathan Sarna. He's a professor of American Jewish history at Brandeis University. He's author of numerous books, including very recently Lincoln and the Jews, A History, which he co-edited with Benjamin Shapell. The book, which was published by St. Martin's Press, recounts the relationship of the 16th President of the United States with a then still small and relatively uninfluential ethnic group, and it was based on hundreds of archival items, some of them newly unveiled. Hello, Professor Sarna, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here.
So, how influential were Jews in Lincoln's life, really? In the first half of the 19th century, the population of Jews in America was several tens of thousands, out of whom very few were in the Midwest, which was Lincoln's home turf.
So, Lincoln's life really coincides with the first great migration of Jews to the United States. When Lincoln is born, probably not more than 3,000 Jews in the whole country, mostly in East Coast cities. By the time Lincoln is assassinated in 1865, there were over 150,000 Jews in the United States, and they're spread all across the country. Lincoln totally had over 100 Jews whom he interacted with, and indeed we have a chart in the book that displays the levels of interaction. He has a very good Jewish friend, Abraham Jonas, whom he knows from a fairly young age in Illinois, and that's important because what we know is that people who have friendships with Jews or with individuals from otherwise despised religions and ethnic groups tend to be less subject to prejudice. How can you say that about Jews? My friend Abraham Jonas is not like that at all. Later, he was rather friendly with a chiropodist, means a podiatrist, named Issachar Zachary. So Lincoln was comfortable with Jews in a way that most Americans of his day were not. He also was comfortable interacting with blacks in a way that others were not. It would be unthinkable for most Americans in his day to refer to someone like Frederick Douglass as my friend, Mr. Douglass. But there's Lincoln, and that's what he says, and he is willing to invite him into the White House and the like. So,
to what extent, Jonathan, was this disposition fed by his religious beliefs and religious upbringing?
Lincoln's religious upbringing is extremely interesting. He's clearly something of a religious outsider in America, meaning that his parents belong to a rather small Protestant sect that believes that really everything has been predestined. In some ways, I think that made Lincoln more tolerant. If you were predestined to be a Jew, that's what God made you, not up to me to pass judgment or to try and change you. Lincoln accepted people as they were. Lincoln did not consider himself a good Christian in the sense that his parents felt one needed to have a conversion experience and he, much to his unhappiness, had not had one. But especially as the Civil War goes on, and he is trying to understand what could possibly be God's reason for all of these deaths and so much blood, he certainly returns to religion and to a spiritual quest. And one can easily see that in his second inaugural, which is really an effort to understand the Civil War, which he sees as something of a divine punishment for the sin of slavery. In some ways, Lincoln is among our most religious presidents in his great knowledge of the Bible and the public religiosity that he displays. But in many other ways, he differs from other Americans, never sees religion as a tool for the majority against the minority. In the 1850s, when so many Americans engaged in anti-Catholicism, some of them, many really sympathizing or joining with the so-called Know-Nothing Party, Lincoln takes no part in any of that. And indeed, in a chapter that's very important for Jews, when the effort is made to reserve the chaplaincy for ministers of some Christian denomination, it's Lincoln who helps Jews open up the chaplaincy to non-Christians of every sort.
There were some Jews who were instrumental in his rise to power. What can you tell us about them?
Well, the most important by far was the lawyer Abraham Jonas. Jonas is very similar to Lincoln in many ways, fascinated by politics, a successful lawyer, a fine orator, and the like. And we know that Jonas both puts forth Lincoln's name at a time when others did not know him, and then also manages, in many ways, the campaign at the 1860 Republican Convention. He got word of the tactics that William Seward, who was another candidate, later would be a cabinet member, candidate for the presidency, Jonas got word of the Seward tactics, and he made sure that there would be plenty of Abraham Lincoln supporters in the hall, and the idea was to ensure that Seward did not win on the first ballot, and that after that, people would be free to vote for their second choice, and a lot of people's second choice was Lincoln. Jonas also helps to craft the Republican Party strategy of trying to link together many groups of outsiders into the Republican camp, and there is actually a document never before seen in which Jonas includes the so-called Israelites, meaning the Jews, as part of that strategy. Perhaps the first time that any president thought seriously about something called the Jewish vote. Doesn't mean all Jews voted for Lincoln, but it does mean that Jonas played a role in crafting his electoral strategy.
Which brings me to my next question. Was it controversial at all? Was Lincoln labeled a friend of the Jews in a pejorative sense?
There certainly were people who criticized Lincoln for the friends he had and felt that this was a reflection of his bad character and upbringing, that if you grew up in the primitive areas, you didn't know social hierarchies properly. But of course, that's exactly what Lincoln had no interest in. There's certainly, even in the Jewish community, were people who thought that Lincoln was a kind of primitive. The great Reform rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, when he sees Lincoln, says that he reminds him of a farmer who's come for the first time to the city, didn't quite know how to dress or comport himself. But Wise and many others were later very impressed with Lincoln. As I have to say, I think the contemporary scholar who works on Lincoln is impressed. I was, that his outer demeanor and his inner self are one and the same. You read his private letters, and you are impressed with this amazing moral figure, a man who really was striving to do what he thought was right. There is not the kind of disjunction between the personal and the public that you see in so many people and so many presidents. What you see on the outside was what is also reflected in those thousands of surviving Lincoln letters.
So this really strong sense of, I would say, honesty, or maybe being on the level, if you like, was this really what was at the very basis, the origin of his attitude towards minorities, be them black or Jews or others?
I mean, the idea that this was Honest Abe, although originally that was just created for the campaign, I think anyone who reads the Lincoln material sees how accurate that was. And I think that Lincoln took very, very seriously the notion that all men, we would say all people, are created equal. It didn't mean he thought that they were equal in all degrees, but he definitely felt that in terms of the rights that they deserved, they were equal, and that's what he said, and that's later what he fights for and is enormously important for him. His views on how to end slavery evolve for a long time. He wanted to prevent war. For some time, he supported an idea of Henry Clay, who was his ideal. Henry Clay, the important senator, who wanted a system of compensated emancipation. But in the end, and in his own way, he comes to understand the importance of simply emancipating the slaves, which, of course, he does on January the 1st, 1863. And one of the things we reveal, only an aside, but it's interesting and shows how Jews have become significant, is that the person who sat at the telegraph office and topped that out to the world was, in fact, a young Jew named Edward Rosewater, who later goes on and becomes a very significant journalist after the war.
Yeah. Did he have any thoughts, or maybe initial incipient thoughts, about Zionism, or perhaps proto-Zionism, because it wasn't really anything realistic at the time?
I mean, the word Zionism, of course, isn't going to come into existence for a generation, but I think that we can see his interest in the restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land, which was an idea that had been much talked about in America, and there is a moment when that comes up. A man, a rather unusual figure who sees himself as a Christian prophet, whose name is Monk, comes from Canada to the White House, and Lincoln interviews him, and this monk really is interested in the restoration of the Jews, and Lincoln, in responding to Monk, albeit in a somewhat jocular fashion, does refer to giving the Jews what he calls a leg up, and seeing their restoration. There is some evidence, disputed, that because it comes only from his wife, we don't have it from Lincoln himself, that Lincoln hoped that he would travel to what was then Palestine after his term as president ended. I take it as genuine because quite a number of other Americans, including Ulysses S. Grant and Seward, are going to travel to the Holy Land. Steam made that possible, and a man like Lincoln, who was a spiritual seeker, I think may well have thought, I'll travel to the Holy Land, and I'll truly begin to understand what I have not been able to fathom up to now. I'll see those holy sites and so forth. Tragically, of course, he's cut down in his second term, and that never happens, but his wife insists that on the very day that he was assassinated, he was talking about this future trip that he would take to Jerusalem.
Fast forward to the 21st century. How is Lincoln remembered today among American Jews? And I'd like you to focus specifically on American Jews rather than the nation as a whole. And do you think that this image is justified?
I think in the United States, those Jews who know Lincoln really revere Lincoln. There is almost nobody in American politics over the past few centuries who is as revered as Lincoln. So I certainly meet people who have Lincoln's picture or Lincoln's bust in their home. This is particularly true of Jews whose ancestors had been in the United States at the time of the Civil War. Indeed, my wife's grandfather had such a bust of Lincoln and remained a member of the Republican Party, even though he didn't vote for most Republican candidates, but he remained a member of the Republican Party because that was the party of Lincoln. Now, East European Jews, who are the majority, 2.5 million, come long after Lincoln, but some of them had heard of Lincoln. There are works in Yiddish about Lincoln, and that image of Lincoln, whether they fully understood it, a man who emancipated blacks, who was honest, who seemed to them to represent values that they held dear, and certainly was very different than Tsar Nicholas, that image was one that they brought with them. The great Jewish leader Solomon Schechter has a remarkable essay in which he talks about learning about Abraham Lincoln, reading about Abraham Lincoln in Romania. And I'm sure that there were others who had the same experience, so much so that, for example, a man named Hertz, who is actually the brother of Chief Rabbi Joseph H. Hertz, produces an enormous book of Jewish sermons about Lincoln. Hertz didn't know Lincoln, but it was the respect with which he held Lincoln that led him to devote so much attention to Lincoln, and an extraordinary number of collectors of Lincolniana, people who have collected material by or about Abraham Lincoln, a totally disproportionate number of them have in fact been Jews. And some of the great experts on Lincoln, like Professor Harold Holzer, who won the Lincoln Prize this year, are similarly proud Jews who see in Lincoln the embodiment of what it was that made America great and that America stands for its greatest values, even if it doesn't always realize them.
All right, Professor Jonathan Sarna, you teach American Jewish history at Brandeis University, and you're the co-author of the recently published Lincoln and the Jews, A History. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
לקחת את ידי בידך ואמרת לי